Shalom to all, and welcome to our conversation on this day, which is Tet Zayin B'Tevet Tavshin Pei, according to our Jewish calendar, corresponding to the 5th of January 2026, according to the Gregorian calendar. And with me, once again, are Rabbi Michael Friedman and Mia Rosenholtz, both of whom are also experts in the medical health field. So I asked you what was on your
Mental
mind.
health,
So let's begin
right?
with Michael.
Right. The mental health field. Was that what you said? Yeah.
Yes.
Mental health. Yeah.
Thank you, Rav Bar-Hayim and Dr. Meir Rosenholtz. Very glad to join you again. It strikes me that today the state of the Jewish people is very, very precarious and very challenging from a mental health point of view. It seems to me that the major opposition that's happening in the state of Israel is surrounding service of the army, Torah students opposing service of the army, and those who are unwilling to see their study of Torah as service to the country. And in the extreme forms, both sides seeing the other as part of an outgroup. I see this as a psychological malady rather than seeing us as an integrated whole nation and members of an extended family of the Jewish people and their concept of peoplehood and as a nation. Instead, the other, the out group, is seen as a threat directly to my vision for my life and for my community. And there's a tremendous amount of distrust. And I see this spiritual malady, emotional malady, really tracing back to Joseph, the biblical Joseph and his brothers, who the Torah writes, the Bible indicates that they were jealous, and jealousy undergirded all of their opposition, despite all of their rationalizations, and playing throughout Jewish history, including the Second Temple period and the internecine battles that have really torn our people apart. And I see us returning to this, many of us, not all of us, I see many of us returning to this state, which is a tremendously painful place to watch and to be in. I just saw this week Shabbat when we read the Torah portion and the portion from the prophets. We're talking about Joseph, the biblical Yosef, saying everything is from Hashem. He didn't hold his brothers as accountable, although there's a discussion how accountable they were. He says, "You're not in place of God. I'm not in place of God." And what happened to me was meant to happen. And we see also with King David Melech, Rav Bar-Chaim's namesake, also treated his enemy Shimi ben Gera the same way, at least earlier in his life. That this curse, that my enemy's cursing me, is from God, it's from Hashem, and not seeing other people directly as the threat, but seeing my own actions, seeing my own deeds, trying to improve my own deeds, and looking at others merely as messengers and conduits. And I see this huge divide happening in the state of Israel right now, and I'd be glad to hear your thoughts on it.
Meir, would you like to weigh in there?
The only thing I think that's very important, which is exactly what Michael is saying, is there's no sect of the Jewish people that has a monopoly on a relationship to God. And I think we all try to serve God in our ways. God is a lot bigger than just one specific channel. And I think ultimately we all try the best we can. We all gravitate towards the area of service of God. And there's no one sect that can claim, oh, we're the ones who are serving God and not the others. I'm not saying I'm not saying that's being said outright, but I do think that there is some type of underlying unspoken of, oh, we're serving God and you're
I
not.
would actually disagree with you, Meir.
Yes, please.
Only in the following sense, however,
Mhm.
not disagreeing with the
That's fine.
general sentiment, but
Okay.
with this following detail. It is being said explicitly
Oh,
by
okay. I
by
didn't want to go that
various
far.
by
I
various
was
people, by various groups and sects
Yes,
and yeshivot
yes,
and rabbis,
right.
unfortunately.
Wow.
No,
Yeah.
really. I mean, let's be honest.
Yes, yes.
Let's call a
I
spade.
appreciate. Yes,
Let's
I
call a
thank
spade a
you.
spade.
Only you have the shoulders to say that. As much as I would have liked to say that, but I'm glad you said it, and not me.
Well, let's just call a
Yes,
spade a
yes,
spade.
that's right. Yes,
And
absolutely.
I remember hearing already at the age of 18
Mhm.
from some Haredi, so-called ultra-Orthodox uh, cousins of mine, distant cousins of mine from Bnei Brak, with whom I was in contact at the time. Um,
Good time.
they studied in Ponevezh Yeshiva, for example. They died in the wall Litai Bnei Brak Haredim. All right? And they were very straightforward about it. They said, we are Olam Torah. What we say is Torah. What anyone else says is not. And I asked them, why do you think so? And they said, because we have the Messiah. We have the tradition, the correct tradition. And I said, okay, and how do you know this? Why are you so convinced that this is the case? Well, it's just obvious. They said it's everyone knows. It's the Brisker Rov received the tradition from Reb Chaim, and Reb Chaim received it from so and so, and so from so and so, from so and so, and that's the tradition. That's the Messiah. That is the bottom line, and it's not open for discussion. Simple. Now, by saying this, they were not only disqualifying anyone from a non-Haredi perspective, or a perspective which is not 100% Haredi, they were also implicitly and on occasion explicitly including the Sfaradi Torah world, all of the Sfaradi Torah world. It goes without saying that Sfaradi Gedolei Torah are not really Gdolim. I mean, they don't even pronounce the word properly. They don't say Gdolim. They say Gedolim. So they obviously not. They can't be Gdolim. So these people are not cannot be taken seriously. This was once said to me explicitly, and not by a young person, a person of my age at the time. At that time, I was again maybe 18 or 19. This was said to me by a neighbor of a family to whom I'm related, and we used to go to the same shul on Shabbat when I was there in Bnei Brak for Shabbatot, and not infrequently. And he said to me very openly, he said, we don't accept Piskei halacha. Because I mentioned a certain halacha or a certain opinion regarding something, and I mentioned Rav Ovadia Yosef, Zichrono Livracha. And you know that I do not necessarily agree with Rav Ovadia Yosef on everything by any means, but I certainly do not adopt the position that therefore anything that he said must be by definition incorrect. That's clearly not true. I also obviously do not think that he's by definition not right or not correct or not to be relied upon because he was not Ashkenazi. That is obviously not my position. But that is their position. You have to understand. In the Litai Torah world, that is the bottom line. If you're not Litai Ashkenazi and you haven't got the Messiah, which means you don't agree with the party line on everything, then you are not to be taken seriously. So when I mentioned a certain Rav, I won't mention the name, it doesn't matter. I said, what about Rav so and so? And I said, is he a Gadol b'Torah? And they said, no. I said, and how do you know? Because he doesn't agree with the Gdolim. This is the paradigm. This is the self-entrapment into which they have placed themselves. It's a closed circuit. It's like closed circuit TV. You can only see what that particular camera shows you. You cannot see anything else. And that's it. That's what they know. That's what they understand. And that's obviously very limiting. Now, there are also those, to be fair and to be balanced and to be truthful, there are those on the other side of the equation, shall we say, the Sfaradi side of the equation, who adopt a similar position. That when it comes to Torah and specifically halacha, we understand what we're talking about. The Ashkenazim don't. And the halach, the Ikar is like the Shulchan Aruch. Maran, the Beit Yosef said this, and that's it. No one can disagree. Why? Lama kacha. There's no reason. That's just how it is. They'll tell you some kind of a legend about Maran being mipi Rabbanim Nismach, and 250 Rabbanim agreed to the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore it's binding, which is obviously totally spurious. It's not even worth going into such a debate. So you have the exact opposite approach on the other side, and another group of Am Yisrael within Am Yisrael, and what I can add to all of this is the following. From a very early age, when I say early age, I suppose maybe I was 20 or 21, I began to ask myself a very simple question, to which no one was able to provide an answer. It made no difference whom I asked, no one had an answer. The question was as follows. All right, we all know Am Yisrael was in Galut, in exile, for many, many years, many generations. Speaking very roughly, 2,000 years. And within that time, obviously, the Jewish people were scattered across the globe, as we know, in over 100 different countries. But generally, you could speak about like one category referred to as Ashkenazim, another category referred to as Sfaradim, another categories perhaps Temanim, and what else I don't know. There are you could discuss various subgroups as well. And over many generations, they developed different pronunciations and different customs in various areas, and a different approach to halakha. All right, that's a given. It's not a bad thing. It's a reality. That's how it is. That's what happened over time, and it was unavoidable. Now that Am Yisrael has returned, or much of Am Yisrael has returned to Eretz Yisrael, to our homeland, and very shortly, according to almost all authorities, all demographers, within a very short space of time, matter of years, maybe a decade, and it could be that this is already the case, but according to all authorities, this will be the case before long, that a majority, over 50% of the Jews in the world will be living in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, that involves some certain discussions. Who is a Jew? How do you define a Jew? But however you define it, that's the reality, according to everybody, which also has halachic ramifications. But the fact is, Am Yisrael has returned, or is in the process of returning, and has largely returned to Eretz Yisrael. That being the case, are we supposed to strive for some kind of unification, some kind of redefinition and reconstitution of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael? Or are we supposed to continue as if we are still living each in his own particular version of the Galuth, of the exile? So Hungarian and Polish Jews will continue to behave as if they were still in Warsaw or Budapest, and Moroccan Jews will continue to behave as if they were still in Marrakesh, and Litaim will continue to as if they were in Vilna and Minsk and Pinsk and Dvinsk, and so on, and Temanim as if they were still in Sana'a, and that's how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that no one should even entertain the thought of somehow reconstituting, redefining, reformulating our connection with Hashem and our Judaism and our halachic practice, etc. This is the question that I asked myself.
I have a challenge question for you,
Sure.
Rabbeinu.
Sure.
Given that your question is, to me, extremely logical and appropriate and helpful at their stage in Jewish and world history, that's as a given. In my view, I agree that should be a destination. And also given that there's this tremendous distrust of anyone who's doesn't look like me and dress like me and talk like me and have all of the external trappings of my particular flavor of the exile, how would you recommend getting how would you recommend getting to the reconstitution and the unity of purpose, of idea, and carrying the mantle of the Bible and Torah and being Hashem's ambassadors in the world? How would you get there without your audience already distrustful of the out group, feeling that they're being self-effaced?
Yeah, that's a very legitimate question. Very correct question. So let me tell you, I have found there are probably many other sources that I have not found, or that I did not recall, but I recall offhand two sources, or two Chachamim, two great Chachamim who related to this question. And to them it was obvious that Am Yisrael will have to reformulate and reconstitute its existence in Eretz Yisrael in the future, because they were talking, they spoke about these things a long time ago. One of these Chachamim was Harav Yehuda al-Kalai, Zichron Livracha, who was from Serbia. Technically, you could say he was, I suppose you could say Sfaradi, but whatever, perhaps not North African Sfaradi and not Middle Eastern Sfaradi. There were many communities of Jews in the Balkans, and that's where he was from. Towards the end of his life, he was able to come to Yerushalayim with his wife, and he passed away here. And that was 160 years ago, or 150 or 40 years ago. He wrote various books and kuntresim about. He was very concerned and focused much on this question of and anything to do with the Geulah Yisrael, with the redemption, how it would be and how it would come about and what we need to do. He was basically, in many ways, you could say, one of the very first to openly discuss and advocate and suggest that the Jewish people's Geulah, their redemption, depends to a large extent on their own actions and their willingness to take certain actions, such as coming to Eretz Yisrael, such as building up the land and what have you. And he discusses this question of how this unification process or this reformulation of the Jewish people might take place. And he says, which is a very reasonable thing to say, he claims that, well, that's really quite straightforward. We will establish a Sanhedrin. We will reintroduce the Semicha. We will reintroduce some kind of national agreed upon Beth Din, and they will discuss these things, and they'll tell us what to do. Simple. It sounds very simple, and in principle it is, and it should be so. Another Chacham who also discussed these matters, going back already 125 years, and even more perhaps, is Harav Kook, Zichron Livracha, Harav Avraham Yitzchak Kohen Kook. He discusses these things, even in fairly practical terms, and he says something to the same effect, much the same effect. He says that we will need to, and we will be able to reunite the Jewish people from this point of view. In other words, we'll be able to get rid of these artificial Galuth-based divisions and categorizations of Ashkenazim and Sfaradim and this minhag and that minhag and this posek and that posek. We will be able to overcome all of this when we have a Sanhedrin, and they will show us the way. And that's basically what they said on the subject. However, it's also a fact that the same Rav Kook, many years later, something like 30 years later, wrote to Harav, I'm not sure what is, if I'm getting the name correct now, his name was Harav Pinchas Kohen, perhaps, from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, something HaKohen. And he was also someone who was very focused and concerned with these discussions. And he was pushing Rav Kook to try and establish the Sanhedrin. And Rav Kook, at that point, this is towards the end of Rav Kook's life, Rav Kook wrote to this person that it's in principle, you're right, it's correct, and I would want that to be the case and to take place. But I see that the Jewish people as it exists, I see the Torah world as it exists, is so fractured and divided that unfortunately I don't see any practical possibility of bringing this about at the present time. And therefore I'm not discussing this openly and explicitly. That's what Rav Kook said. So what am I getting at? Lichora, it should be the most obvious and straightforward thing to gather all the Chachamim, many of the Chachamim together in Eretz Yisrael, and as Rambam describes explicitly in a few places in his Perush on the Mishnah, Masechet Sanhedrin, and in Chov Sanhedrin, in Mishneh Torah, Rambam there discusses how the Sanhedrin, how the Semicha, proper rabbinical ordination, could be reinstituted, which basically is straightforward enough. He says, you get all the Chachamim together in Eretz Yisrael. And obviously, all is not ever possible, so all means a clear majority of the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael together. And they have to agree amongst themselves who amongst them is the leader, who is the greatest amongst them. And the moment that they agree to such a thing, they say he is our leader, he is the Rosh, then he becomes Samuch. That's it. That's the whole story. Because what is smicha? Smicha is permission. It is a recognition on the part of Chachamim that you are a Chacham. When a Rav gives his student smicha, what's he doing? He's recognizing the fact and making it known that I consider this person to be a Chacham who can be posek halacha. That's what it's supposed to be anyway. So that's what Rambam writes. There are those who raise their eyebrows at this suggestion, but the truth is this is the only possible way of going about it. So as soon as that agreement exists and a certain person is chosen, he becomes the Rosh HaYeshiva, as it's called, or the Samuch in Bimkom Moshe Rabbeinu. He now is the replacement, as it were, for Moshe Rabbeinu in that generation. He is the head of the Chachamim. He is the Rosh HaChachamim, the head of the Sanhedrin, and he goes on to appoint others who will be with him on the Sanhedrin. That's how it should work. That's essentially also what Rav Al-Kalai said, and that's what Rav Kook was driving at. But we also understand that the reality is that this is not possible at the present time, not in any real world sense. Why? Not because the halakha prevents it, not because the Sanhedrin, like the Mikdash, is supposed to fall from heaven, as some claim, but because you cannot possibly get together all the Chachamim to agree to anything at all. And the very first thing they will disagree about is which nusach are we going to daven, and who's going to be the Shliach Tzibur, and do we accept these people as real Chachamim because they're Sfaradim, not Ashkenazim, or vice versa. And we haven't got the same Masorah, so how can we can't agree on anything at all. So yes, you can very possibly, even that's not really very doable, and I speak from experience, but you can gather a certain group of people, even maybe tens of Rabbanim together, and they can agree to such a thing. But then everybody else who was not present will say, well, we don't accept, we don't agree what you came up with, your agreement, your acceptance of this person as the Rosh, as the leader. Well, you didn't ask us, and obviously we know more than you do, so whatever you decided is not to be taken seriously. That's the situation we find ourselves in today.
Do I remember correctly that you had prescient words of warning to the scholars who were trying to reconstitute a Sanhedrin in the recent years? And
yes, that's true.
And
this goes back over 20 years. Go on, sorry.
And is it correct that you echoed the words of Rav Kook about what you think is practical nowadays, and how you warned them that their enterprise would not be accepted in Klal Yisrael, but they did not listen to you?
They did not listen. True. But I'm used to that. Second of all, No, that's obviously no one has to agree with me on anything if they don't wish to, but at least present some argument, present sources, give something rational, something that can work.
Do I recall also that Rav Kook, maybe you can explain this, when the British wanted to establish him as the chief rabbi of the Jewish homeland, even before the state existed, he demurred, so to speak, unless there was also a Sephardi, that he said the Jewish people as it exists now requires both an Ashkenazi and a Sephardi chief rabbi.
I do not claim to be an expert about all the historical details, but it is true. The following two facts are true. There was a period of a few centuries, roughly from about 500 years ago, in the wake of, over 500 years ago, in the wake of the Girush Sfarad, the expulsion of Jews from Spain in Resh Nun Beth, 1492. A fair number of Jews from Spain and later perhaps from Portugal, mainly from Spain, they're scattered around the world. Many went to Italy and many went to Turkey and what have you. Some arrived here in Tzfat, particularly in Tzfat. That's why Tzfat became the center of Jewish activity in Eretz Yisrael at that time. That's why you find that you had there in Tzfat, you had the Beth Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he was from of a family that traced its origins back to Sepharad, to Spain, and eventually they ended up in Turkey, and from Turkey he came to Eretz Yisrael. At that time, of course, the Ottoman Turks ruled over our homeland, and they did for a period of about 400 years. So you had a significant number of Jews in Eretz Yisrael. The larger centers were Safat and also some in Yerushalayim, but fewer, and many fewer, and in some in Hebron, also many fewer. Mainly was in the north of the country, mainly around Safat. And almost all of these Jews were Sephardi in origin. So you had the Rabbi Yosef Karo. Later, the Radbaz came from Mitzrayim. He came to Safat around that period also. He was also Sephardi. You had the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordivero, and the Ari in the field of Kabbalah and what have you. There was much, and there were many, Rabbi Moshe Al Sheikh, all manner of Chachamim. There was much Torah ferment and activity. So this question of a Sanhedrin or reinstituting the smicha came up at that time as well. The Beit Yosef and his Rav, Nari Berav, were for such a thing, according to the Rambam's suggestion, and Nari Berav was chosen as the head Chacham, and therefore they claimed that the smicha had been reinstituted, and he began to be masmich some of his talmidim, including Rabbi Yosef Karo and others. The Ramak was nismach, and there were many others. And this reality lasted for a couple of generations at most, and then it all unraveled. But it was never accepted totally, even at that time, by everybody. The Ralbah in Yerushalayim disagreed with the entire process and said the whole thing. First of all, what the Rambam says is it's not clear that it is so. I would disagree with that, and so did many other Chachamim. But that was his position anyway. He didn't accept it. And it didn't really take hold within the Jewish people. And there's also historical reasons for that, because the Jewish Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael began to, after a period of a few generations, began to shrink, and the surge of activity, Jewish activity, Torah activity, began to dissipate. And the upshot of all this was that Eretz Yisrael once again became pretty much a backwater, as it had been previously. So in that reality, but around that time and for some centuries after, so we're talking about the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Leminyanam, the vast majority of Jews in Eretz Yisrael were of Sephardi origin. And under the Ottoman Empire, you were defined as a subject of the Ottoman Empire. You were defined by your religion. So you could be a Muslim subject of the Ottoman Sultan, and you could be a Christian subject, and you could be a Jewish subject, and maybe there were a couple of others. You had to belong to one of those Jewish communities. That was how you couldn't just exist. You weren't just a citizen, Mr. A, Yossi Cohen or John Smith. No such thing. You had to belong to one of these categories, these religious divisions. And each division, and this was all controlled by the Ottoman authorities. And they appointed a head of each, they appointed or recognized the head of each religious community. So the head of the Jewish community in Eretz Israel under the Turks was there was a Rav, a Sfaradi Rav, who was known as the Hacham Bashi, and he was the head of the Jewish community, and he was the representative of the Jewish community vis-a-vis the authorities. Not entirely, by the way, unlike the situation going back 2,500 years and or less, in the time of Beit Sheni, the time of the Second Temple. The representative of the Jewish people vis-a-vis the Persian Empire and later the Greek Empire was the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest. That's a long story also, but without going into all the details and all the unfortunate things that took place at that time, if we return to the Ottoman period, the Hacham Bashi, that Rav, was the institutionalized, recognized official leader of the Jewish community, of all Jews, under Ottoman rule. So that position existed going back centuries, going before Rav Kook ever showed up on the scene, obviously. When did Ashkenazi Jews begin to return initially in small numbers to Eretz Israel? At the end of the 18th century, the Minyanam, at the beginning of the 19th century. Initially, there was a small number of Hasidim, Talmidei, Baal Shem Tov, or Talmidei, Baal Shem Tov, students of the Baal Shem Tov, the head of the Hasidic movement centered in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, who came to Eretz Israel, not because they wanted to build up the country in any physical or real world sense. That was not on the agenda. They came because they considered this to be Eretz Yisrael was a more spiritual place. Obviously, that no argument about that. The land itself is imbued with a spirituality, with the Shekhinah, even at time of Galuth, and therefore it is more conducive to Avodat Hashem. So if you're able to come here and do Avodat Hashem here, you're more properly plugged into the source. That's the idea. But they didn't really this didn't develop in any real world sense for a long time. It also began to unravel after a time. And this is, of course, the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe used to send money to those few Jews here, so they would, in order to support them, because they were unable to work or they were unwilling to work, or in some cases it was both. And sometimes it was they didn't want to work because they came here to study Torah and to daven, and not to build anything of a pragmatic nature. On the other hand, it was also the case that the Turks didn't allow Jews to buy land, for example, or to agricultural land, all sorts of things. So there weren't that many options. A little bit later, in the early 19th century, you had a movement of Talmidim, students of the Gra, or students of the Gra, of the Gal Mivilna, Rabbeinu Eliyahu Mivilna, who came here. And they took root here in a more meaningful fashion. They began in Safat with Rabbi Yisrael Mishklov, who was the leader, the author of the Ba'ath HaShulchan, amongst other things. He was a close Talmid of the Gra for the last 6 months of the Gra's life. He learned with the Gra every day for the last 6 months of his life. And there was another Chacham, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Mishklov, and he was more into Kabbalah, and he wanted to come to Yerushalayim, which the Ottomans weren't allowing, and he pressed for nevertheless circumventing and disregarding the Ottomans' rules and regulations and coming to Yerushalayim, and eventually he succeeded in doing that. And they established the Ashkenazi Jewish Yishuv in Yerushalayim, and also in Safat initially. So that was the first time that Ashkenazim began to return in any significant numbers to Eretz Yisrael. So that was a period of about 300 years, roughly, a little bit less perhaps. No, it's true to say 300 years, where almost all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael were Sfaradi. There were no Ashkenazim. And then these two aliyot, these two groups of Jews arrived here and settled here. More specifically, more significantly, the Talmidim of the Gra. You know, if you go to Yerushalayim and you can see the old buildings in places like Sharei Hesed near Rehavia, etc. This is where and also in Meir She'arim and other places, this is where they settled down. So you had this new influx of Ashkenazi Jews, but not huge numbers, at the beginning of the 19th century, and then that began to change. In other words, increasingly more and more Jews came from Europe, Ashkenazim, initially mainly from Romania, for reasons that we can discuss or not right now, and that was what's known as the Aliyah Rishona. We're talking about the mid to late 1880s, Leminiana. There are a few came a little bit before, but mainly talking about that time. And that's when you had that they began to settle in various places known as the Moshavot, the colonies, literally. In other words, places like Petach Tikwa and Zichron Yaakov and Rishon LeZion. Its name tells you, Rishon LeZion. That was the first of those places set up by these Jews. So now you had this new reality. You had increasingly Ashkenazi communities and Sephardi communities in Eretz Yisrael. When the British came along and drove out the Ottomans from our homeland in Tau Resh Ein Zayin, 1917, Lebanon, that's when General Allenby entered Yerushalayim. And eventually they received a mandate over what was called Palestine, or what was renamed, one should say, what was renamed Palestine. It wasn't called Palestine before that. It was, or not really. It was just it was called part of Greater Syria, but a province of the of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't specifically called by that name at all. But in order to separate it and distinguish it from previous Ottoman rule, it was now renamed Palestine. And the British received this territory, which included what is today called Jordan and Eretz Yisrael and what have you. And the British carved out for themselves in the wake of the First World War. They already began to plan this in 1916. Sykes-Picot began to discuss this. These two representatives of the French colonial interests and British colonial interests, and they began to divide up the territory. So Syria and Lebanon became French all of a sudden, and Iraq, a country that never existed, became who'd ever heard of Iraq? No one had. It was a British colony or mandate. Why? Because there was oil there, so that was important. So anyhow, they divided up the Middle East as they saw fit for their own, entirely based on their own interests. So now that the British are ruling in what was called Palestine, but that we refer to more correctly, more precisely as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And they also wanted to make some provision for the various religious and cultural groups under their control. So they already had the Sfaradi rabbi or head rabbi, the Hacham Bashi. That was not new. They didn't invent that. But now, increasingly, the Jews in Eretz Israel, the majority now were Ashkenazi, not Sfaradi, and they were certainly the more prominent and influential politically and religiously as well, and intellectually. So it was obvious that you needed some new system. So the British came up with this idea of a chief rabbinate. The chief rabbinate, the Rabut Rashid, was invented by the British. And Rav Kook was a natural candidate to be the head of this, together with a Sfaradi Rav, Rav was it Rav Uziel, or before that it was someone, Rav Meir, I don't remember. So they established this Rabbanut Rashid, which was basically a British invention. But of course, none of that should be seen as justification for or necessitating our continuing to exist and to function along those lines. That was the reality then, and that it's not as if and there were not many Jews who thought in terms of a united Jewish people, or it hadn't yet. It wasn't. We're talking about about 127-8 years ago now. So Jews were simply not incapable of thinking in terms of a Jewish nation, but when they viewed themselves as Ashkenazim or Sfaradim, etc. And we are still unfortunately living in that paradigm. It's not that the British or the Turks invented the paradigm of Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. This already existed well before that, centuries before that. But and that was simply a reflection of the reality in the Galuth, in the exile. But obviously, we today need to think in different terms. So I go back to the story with which I began. I began to ask different Rabbanim and different people, so how do we reconstitute the Jewish people as opposed to Jewish communities, rather than having transplanted communities from Turkey or Egypt or Syria or Lebanon into Eretz Israel, who maintain that original identity, and having transplanted communities from Hungary and Poland and Russia in Eretz Israel, and everyone continues as before, as if nothing has happened. How do we change anything to do with this equation? And universally, the response was a shrug. No one had any idea. But one thing they were very clear about, most people I spoke to, people with a Torah background, it was very clear to everyone that we are not in any way able or permitted to change anything at all about what we do, how we do it. So I can give you an example. Many, many years ago, this is probably nearly 40 years ago, I went to a Shalom Zachar on a Friday night, Leil Shabbat, in someone's home in the neighborhood where I lived at the time, in Yerushalayim, in Givat Shaul. And there was a young American Bachur Yeshiva, maybe 18 years old, who was there for some reason. I don't know where he came from. And we began to speak. And I raised the topic of pronunciation of Lashon HaKodesh, of the Hebrew language, how it should be pronounced. And I told him what at that time, it wasn't a long time perhaps after I'd learned what I today know, or some of what I know today about the Hebrew and how it should be pronounced. So I began to tell him, and I explained certain things to him. And he said it's very interesting, and in fact what you're saying is very convincing. But according to the halacha, as he put it, we can't do anything about this because I'm required halachically to pronounce Lashon HaKodesh as my grandfather did. That was what he had been taught, obviously. He didn't come up with this by himself. So that is a description of the kind of mental block and the spurious halachic position that we are up against, and why it's very difficult to make any headway.
So the system seems to be set up where there's no room for any other system.
Exactly.
And I mean, I always thought that in order to have a Sanhedrin, in order for there to be real Rabbanim, real Psakim in Klal Yisrael, there has to be a Sanhedrin, there has to be almost like a pillar of cloud has to come from Shemayim, and everyone's eyes has to have to glow. Like in order that we don't have the power. That's how I was always taught. We don't have the power. We're in a very physical world. We're on a very low level. We don't have the authority as a nation to set up a Sanhedrin to change things, perhaps like they used to do hundreds of years ago or 1,000 years ago. And it seems from what you're saying that that's absolutely not the case. We just have to get together. I mean, is that accurate?
You're entirely correct, 100% correct. That is the reality. That is the halachic Torah reality and direction that we should be adopting.
That
But
what is that? What is the
but
halachic?
that's not what people have been trained to think.
Right, right. That there has to be some type. Suddenly, he's gonna get Ruach Kodesh, and the Rebbeinu Shalom is gonna speak through his mouth or something. I mean, this is
What they tell
similar.
themselves is, again, because I've
Right,
discussed this matter with so many people over the years, for
hmm
decades, and different kinds of people. You should understand it's not just Haredim who will respond in this way. It's also religious Zionists. It's also all manner of people.
hmm
Sfaradim, Ashkenazim, Temanim. They'll all tell you the same thing. Kulam tzachim lamshich v'yinhag avoteihem. Everyone has to continue doing as their forefathers did. And this is true about everything. So it's true about how you pronounce Lashon HaKodesh, and it's true with regards to a question such as may you eat rice on Pesach or not, and it's true about anything else you care to mention. Everyone is chayav to continue in the Masorah or the Masoret or however you pronounce it of their forefathers. Now, if that is an halachic imperative. If that is the case, it follows that change, even for the better, is not possible. It's anti-halachic. That's why this particular young man at this particular Shalom Zachar, I remember very well to this day. So I explained to him how I know that, a vav is a waw, and how a het is a het and not a chaf, and why a toyth is a toyth and not a tau, and how I know, and where some of the sources I mentioned a few things. And he said that's all very interesting and very convincing, in fact. But as I said, he said, I cannot act upon that. No, nor can anyone else, because the halacha is that I must continue pronouncing Hebrew according to what my grandfather did. So when I asked questions such as, well, do you believe that let's say, not your grandfather, but your great-great-grandfather, or his great-grandfather, or his great-grandfather, did they pronounce Hebrew throughout those generations exactly the same? There were no changes, nothing changed. You think it's exactly, it was maintained precisely in a pristine state over a thousand years, 2,000 years? Is that what you think? He said, I don't know, but I know how my grandfather pronounced it, and that's what I have to do. It reminds me of another conversation I had once with an elderly Haredi Yerushalmi gentleman. And I remember very well this conversation. It took place in a Bet Knesset called Bet Knesset Purushim in Givat Shaul, and we got discussing various things, I was a fairly young avrech. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, but I was probably 30, early 30s. And I asked him about the way he was dressed. He wore this Yerushalmi, wide brim, flat hat, long coat, etc. Which I have nothing against long jackets or long coats, by the way. I think it's probably more proper than short jackets. But that's not the question now. I asked him, why do you dress this way? He said, because my father and my grandfather dressed this way. I said, okay, I understand that. Tell me, do you think that their grandfathers dressed in exactly this fashion, or their grandfather, the grandfather of the grandfather of the grandfather? And he said, and I said, because we know how Jews dressed. If you go, there are ways of, there are paintings, there are descriptions. That it's very clear how Jews, your own ancestors, if you go back, for example, 200 years, 300 years, 400, 500 years, you can see they didn't dress in this fashion. They dressed in a different style because this particular style grew up. We know roughly when and where it grew up and how it came about. So, in other words, I can prove to you that at some point in your own family's history, your ancestors changed their mode of dress over time. It's not the case that they always continued in the footsteps of their father or grandfather exactly in terms of dress. That's factually not true. Of course, he couldn't respond to this intelligent argument. So what did he say? He said, I don't know about that. I just know that my grandfather dressed this way or my father dressed this way. And therefore I'm chayav, I'm required to do the same. That was his argument. It's exactly the same as this young man said to me about the pronunciation of Hebrew. I don't know, you may be entirely correct in everything you say, but it makes no difference because I have to pronounce Hebrew the way my grandfather pronounced Hebrew. So I said to him, in other words, and that's the halakha. I said, all right, so what you're telling me is that even if we can prove conclusively that your grandfather or your great-grandfather or his grandfather pronounced Hebrew in a certain way, and we can demonstrate conclusively that this is mistaken, that it's mishubash, that it is a misrepresentation and a mispronunciation of the Hebrew language. And we can even explain how these mistakes crept into the pronunciation over time. And we can also learn and discover the correct pronunciation. You're telling me that the halakha requires you to mispronounce Hebrew rather than pronounce it correctly, because that's the halakha, that's how it is. So the halakha and what Lashon HaKodesh should sound like have nothing to do with each other. There may be certain objective facts regarding the Hebrew language and pronunciation in different places, different times, what you can ascertain by studying many sources, etc., not to mention going to those people who have maintained a living tradition up to the present time, such as, for example, the Temanim, who largely are those who were the most successful up to the present time in maintaining a much more authentic pronunciation of Hebrew. Well, I'm not saying that they're perfect, but closer than anybody else. This is what was said to me personally by the Rav who taught me these things, Rabbi Ben Zion Kohen, and he was not Temani. He was from Jerba, from Tunisia, from North Africa. A Kohen, by the way, he was a Kohen Ben Ahar Ben from Ezra Sofer. He was a Kohen Miyuhas, Mamash, Legamre.
Wow.
It's not a joke. I saw the Ktav Yehus of his family going back to 4 generations before his time. And we know that most of the Jews in Jerba were Kohanim. And anyway, so a very interesting individual, a Tamid Chachamim, and a tremendous expert on these matters. And he said to me, and he was not Temani, I repeat, he said the Temanim are not correct in everything, but they are the closest to the truth. So you can look into the various sources, which Rabbi Ben Zion Kohen, like others, wrote about. He wrote a couple of books on the subject, one a very thick tome, another one a condensed version thereof, in which he brings many myriad sources for every claim, how to pronounce this letter, this consonant, and how to pronounce that vowel, etc. All right, so you can study these things, and you can also go and listen to people who have this a living tradition, how it sounds. But so it is possible, but you're telling me, despite all that, the Torah prevents us and disallows us from doing so. Again, that is an approach to the Torah. That is an halachic and Torah outlook, which locks into place all the possible mistakes and aberrations and problematic aspects of Galut Judaism, and locks them into place and places them on a pedestal, and claims that this is how it must be for all time. Well, obviously, and if you ask these people, and that's just to round out this thought, if you ask any of these people who hold such views, all right, so how And when will such things change, if ever? The answer is always very straightforward. Exactly the same answer that the Rambam mentions that people in his day already would suggest with regards to how the Samicha and the Sanhedrin would be reconstituted. In other words, we do nothing, absolutely nothing about it. The Mashiach will come and he'll take care of it. So what are you worried
That's
about? That's the
that's
answer.
exactly.
That's the answer.
That's right.
That's how the Mikdash will be built. That's how
That's
Samicha,
right.
the Beit Din HaGadol, will be reconstituted. And that's Mimela also how we will
Mhm.
discover, perhaps in the future, how to pronounce Lashon HaKodesh. The Mashiach. That it's a catch-all, childish, non-starter response, but that's the response.
Mhm. There is an underlying issue, Rav, when you speak about pronouncing the letters differently. The underlying issue is if we got that part of the Masorah wrong, what else could we have possibly gotten wrong? That's a very scary question.
Yeah, okay, I hear you.
And unfortunately, it just leaves one wondering, uh-oh, what else is wrong? And who knows what else I'm doing is wrong? I mean, that's that's a big problem.
This is without a doubt one of the reasons, perhaps the major reason, for this opposition, for this attitude, and the opposition to any change of any kind.
Mhm.
I must
I've
destroy
always
you.
heard. I've always heard the Masorah is perfect. Everything we got, it's totally maybe a few, but a few little details, but basically it's always the same.
If you want me to change, then you are a threat. You are a threat to the divinity of the Torah. You're a threat to my father's and my grandfather's way of life. You're a threat to how my community relates socioculturally to each other.
Mhm.
You're a threat to our education system, and you have to be
Mhm.
destroyed. And you have to be labeled as the maskilim. Literally, this is literally, you have to be labeled
Mhm.
as those who are seeking to destroy all that is holy and pure.
Right. Like you said earlier, Michael, the other. You're the other side. It's us against you.
You're not just
The
the
other,
other, you're evil. You're the
the
evil
evil.
other.
Right, right, right. Wow. This
And
is
as Michael says, you are a threat.
mhm,
Uh,
right.
and you are undermining
Mhm.
Yiddishkeit.
Mhm.
And the Torah itself testifies about great tzaddikim, the great righteous brothers of Yosef for the tribes. It testifies they were righteous, and yet they swindled themselves. Unbeknownst to them, they swindled themselves based on an emotion. The emotional fear of what Yosef could represent, which was a different, feel free to weigh in. What the biblical Joseph represented was a different vision of Torah, a different integration of how the Torah and our mission, national mission, was meant to evolve. And they perceived him as a threat. Underneath it were emotions from a mental health lens. Underneath it was the
I
Torah said
see.
they were
Mhm.
jealous. And the Torah, and I understand from a great scholar who wrote Patterns in Time, he wrote that the Torah says nichle datot, that they used religious suppositions to try to bring, so to speak, bring the biblical Joseph to court. And Rashi says vayith nachlu, they swindled themselves. They didn't realize when they were trying to bring religious justifications for their solipsistic outlook, they actually convinced themselves of the authenticity and the purity of their motives, and they dragged Hashem into it also from their lens.
This is mamish and Yonah Dioma. This is exactly what's going on today. We are supposed to believe that no rabbis have any agendas. There's no system that is purposely being upheld. We're just supposed to just hear whatever it is and just be makabel it. Just accept it. They're pure. Wow.
Well, first of all, it's clear that a human being remains a human being no matter what.
Mhm.
Second of
Uh,
and therefore all human beings may err, may be wrong about this or that thing. There may be various reasonable, logical, legitimate or quasi-legitimate arguments why we should act in this way or why we should reject such and such. And I can speak about that as well, but that doesn't necessarily make that position correct. I want to read something to you both. Let me just go get the book off the shelf just a moment, okay? The Rav that I mentioned, whom I met in a miraculous way, one could say, lichora, entirely by chance, Rabbi Ben Zion Cohen from Jerba, who lived in Yerushalayim, very near to Sha'ar Shechem, in an area known as I'm not sure the Hebrew name for the neighborhood is perhaps it's Kolmamiyuth, or perhaps it's something else. I think I'm maybe confusing that, but the Arab name, which is still the commonly used name, unfortunately, is Musarara. And I know where he used to live, and unfortunately, he passed away at a young age in his 50s many years ago, and that's a very great loss. At any rate, his name was Rabbi Ben Zion Cohen. He wrote various things. One of the books he wrote is this book here, which is called Safaf Emath and Sifteh Kohen. He was a Kohen. This is a very thick volume, as you can see. Chock full, printed in not even a terribly user-friendly fashion. In other words, it's a lot of
small
text.
Print.
It's a lot of text to get through, and he brings every possible argument and discussion and reason and proof with regards to the correct pronunciation of Hebrew. Okay. So if a person wants to get, and this book, I believe, is essentially unavailable, as far as I know. Safat Emath and Sifteh Kohen. On the back, on the spine, it says Miftah Lashon HaKodesh Kahalacha.
Wow.
But if you haven't got the time to read all of that, and that's many hundreds of pages, he wrote a condensed version called Kosht Imre Emeth. It's the same book, instead of bringing 30 proofs for everything that he writes, literally 30 proofs, he'll bring you 5 for each thing, for every point.
Is that book available, the shorter version?
I think it is not very available, but I've heard that it is available. You can try and look it up. All right, so now this Sefer, which was printed here according to what it says on the opening page in Taushin Mem Tet, 1989. You mean you know? He brings, first of all, there are many Rabbanim who wrote him various haskamot, letters, and approbations. And he mentions in his introduction, he quotes here both Harav Sfra Divlitsky, whom I knew from Bnei Brak, who was Ashkenazi, and Harav Meir Mazuz, Rosh Yeshiva of Kiser Hamim, who passed away about a year ago or something, and many others, all kinds of Chachamim who understood these things. Now, it also has to be said, quite honestly, the vast majority, unfortunately, of Rabbanim, I'm talking about well-known, brand-name Rabbanim, in all communities, simply know nothing or next to nothing or very little with regards to Dikduk and Lashon HaKodesh. So that already is an unfortunate place to begin from. In other words, you yourself have never been taught, and why do they not know? Because they were not taught, and they were not taught because they were told it's not important. We just pronounce it the way we hear,
right.
and we don't need to know these things, which is totally not true. On every possible level, it's not true, but that's what they were taught, and they therefore never took these things seriously.
Right? It does not get more fundamental than Eretz Yisrael and the Aleph Beis. I mean, it doesn't get more fundamental than that.
Exactly.
Those are foundational principles of Klal Yisrael.
So. All right, so we have this book, Kosht Imre Emeth, the condensed short version, as you can see, of that very much thicker book, written in a larger font, etc. So it's much more readily accessible to many people. And he mentions here a book written by an Ashkenazi, I think Haredi individual who I've never met, who's the name of the book. Maybe he's not Ashkenazi. I'm not sure. I've never met him. I think he must have been from the United States. As I understand it, his name was Rabbi Yoshua Ovadia. Doesn't sound very Ashkenazi. I don't know who he is. the reason I think he must have been in the United States is because he turned to her Gaon Rav Yaakov Kaminetzky, whom you've probably heard of, who was a great
Sounds
Chacham.
familiar. Mhm.
And this individual wrote a Haskama to this book, Safa Berura. The name of the book he wrote was Safa Berura, clear, correct language. In other words, this book was also a book written before this book about the correct pronunciation of Hebrew. And Rav Yaakov Kaminetzky wrote, who was a very independently minded individual. And you have to understand, such Rabbanim, even though they were generally recognized as Gedolei Torah, if they didn't toe the party line exactly as certain politicians and certain Rabbanim understood it, how things should be, they were generally sort of censored out or ignored from the mainstream. So people nowadays know less and less about such people. The same is true. You could say something similar about Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was a Talmid of Rav Kook. But most people don't know that he was a Talmid of Rav Kook. My Rav, Rav Moshe Yechiel Tzuriel, or I'm sorry, Rav Yechiel Moshe Tzuriel, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, told me the following story about Rav Hutner, whom he knew in America. He said once he went to visit Rav Hutner on Sukkot, he entered his sukkah, and he closed the door. There was a door, and he closed the door of the sukkah. And on the back of the door, there was a picture of Rav Kook. And he asked Rav Hutner, why is Rav Kook's picture on the back of the door, not on the front of the door? So Rav Hutner explained to him why that it was not in his circles, in the circles in which he moved and in which he taught and in which he lived, it was not acceptable or considered proper to. Rav Kook was verboten. Rav Kook was off the charts, so you couldn't discuss it. It was better not to be associated with him. But he had his picture on the back of the door. People didn't see it; it was on the back of the door. Most people didn't close the door, so they walked in, and the door turned that way, and they never saw the picture. This is what Rav Moshe Tzuriel told me personally.
If I may interject, my Rebbe, Rav Mendel Farber, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was a Talmud of Rav Hutner as well. And he heard from Rav Hutner that a comment Rav Hutner said, at the time of Rav Kook, there was no one alive who had greater Yediot Hashem than Rav Kook. No one had greater understanding of Torah and understanding of Hashem than Rav Kook.
There were many, many people who knew Rav Kook personally, or even maybe not exactly personally, who would have concurred with such an assessment. That's generally recognized by many. At any rate, this individual, whose name is Rabbi Yoshua Ovadia, wrote a book called Safa Berura. He asked Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetzky Zetzal for Haskama. And I want to quote from this Haskama. I will read and translate. לשמחה הייתה לי הידיעה שהחלטת לחבר חיבור שלם בעניין בירור ההברות והמבטא של אותיות לשון תורתנו הקדושה. I'm very pleased that you decided to write this book. כי אפילו אם לא יתקבלו הדברים, even if what you write will not be accepted by most people, חשוב מאוד לברר את האמת. It is very important to clarify and state the truth as it is, whether people will accept or not. כותב אנוכי בלשון כזה מפני שיודע אני כי כמה אנשים יאמרו וכי מי הוא זה שבא לחדש דברים כאלה? Because I'm writing this, he says, because I know there will be all manner of people who will say, who is this person who came out of nowhere, and we've never heard of this person, and he decided to tell us all these chidushim, l'hadesh dvarim kaele, shelo shema'anu me'olam, all these things we've never heard of before. He will tell us all of a sudden how to pronounce Hebrew. We've been reciting things in Hebrew all our lives, and so did our grandfathers, and all of a sudden he discovered that we're all doing it wrong. Who is this person? A chutzpah. And Rav Kaminetzky says, as once a certain important person, he obviously refers to some Rav, he doesn't say who, once said to me, Ahad she'amarti lo she'havarat hadalet harifuyah meshubeshet etzlenu. Rav Kaminetzky, I don't know how he knew this, but he obviously did know. Rav Kaminetzky was a mamash gadol b'Torah, um, and apparently he knew a fair amount about these matters as well, maybe a great deal. But it's not generally recognized or spoken of. But I suppose people who knew who was zochet to know Rav Kaminetzky personally or his family, maybe they knew that would be less surprised than others. Rav Kaminetzky says that I myself once spoke to a certain Adam Hashu, an important Rav apparently, and I said to him that the way we pronounce the Daleth Refuya, in other words, the Ot Daled, without a dot in it. Right? There's a Daled Refuya and a Daled with Refuya without a dot, and a Daled Dechusha with a dot. Like you similar to a Beth, Veth, Gimel, Gimel, Kaf, Chaf, Pe, Fe, Tau, Thau. That's how it should be. That's Beged Kefet, right? Those 6 letters, Beged Kefet, either come with a dot in the middle or without, Dechush or Rafui. And the pronunciation changes, differs according to whether it is Dechush or Rafui, with a dot or without a dot. So most people know about the Beth, the Veth, the Gimel. The Gimel people don't know. Gimel, Gimel. Daled, most people don't know. Kaf, Chaf, people know. Pei, Fe, and Tal, at least Ashkenazim and Sfarad, and Temanim know. Sfaradim don't. So I pointed out to this person, says Rav Kaminetzky, that the way we pronounce it, Daled Refuya, without a dot, is incorrect. Why did he refer to this? Because in Kriyat Shema, in the first pasuk, you have the word Ehad, and you're supposed to be Ma'arich Be'ehad. How do you Ma'arich Be'ehad? How do you lengthen that sound? If it's a Daled, it's simple. It's Ehad. As long as you have breath, you can continue to pronounce that sound, to produce that sound. It's like the pronunciation of the word the, T-H-E, the definite article in English, the. So as long as you have breath, you can say Ehad, and that's what you're supposed to do. That's in the Shulchan Aruch, by the way. But if you pronounce the Daled Refuya like a Daled Dechusha, as most people do, most Faradim, almost all Faradim and all Ashkenazim certainly do, the Temanim have the correct pronunciation here, as is often usually the case. But if you don't know that, then you pronounce it as a Daled. Well, you cannot take a plosive consonant and make it long. You cannot say a had. What do you do? How do you make a d longer? You cannot do that. Some people try and they end up saying something like had or had. They actually pronounce they precede the dada with the nun. All sorts of strange shibushim, strange mistakes and attempts to square the circle. The answer is simple. You're not pronouncing the Daled Refuya correctly. It's not a d, it's a the. Simple enough. So, and Rav Kaminetzky knew this. This is again a seif mefurash in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in the Shulchan Aruch. It holds Kriyat Shema. This it says laharich b'daled. That's wonderful, but how do you do that when you don't know what it is? You've never heard it. What do you do? So there you have an example. You have a seif in the Shulchan Aruch that tells you to do something which you cannot do unless you learn this subject matter from someone who knows and tells you that it's not a daled, it's a daled. Simple. So this person said to me, Rav Kaminetzky says, "V'chit alei da'athach or da'atcha sheba'al chidushei harim lo yatzai de'chova kachma ketikuna." He took an example of a great Rav from Europe, the Baal Chidushei Harim, the Rebbe Migur, and who wrote the sefer called Chidushei Harim. And are you suggesting that he was not Yotzei De'chova Kriyat Shema properly because he didn't know about a daled? Because he only knew about a daled? Ani amarti los, this is Rav Kaminetzky says, wadai sheyatza b'di'avad. It's no question, he was yotzei b'di'avad, the way he read it, because that's the halacha. That even if you don't pronounce everything correctly, yotzei b'di'avad. It's also possible that he himself knew how to read it correctly and did so for himself. But he was unable to influence the entire community to pronounce it properly. So this is what Rav Yaaqov Kaminetzky says.
I heard from his grandson, one of my Rebbeim, that his family pronounces this Daled from Kriyat Shema to this day with the soft Daled.
Well, that's obviously they heard this from Avihem Agadol, Gaon Rav Yaakov Kaminetzky, because apparently this is something that he impressed upon them. At any rate, what do you see here? ask yourself the question: if anyone comes with a book called Safa Berura, written by someone who sounds Faradi, Yoshua or Vadia, whoever that may be, and he comes to your standard Litai Ashkenazi Gadol Torah today and asks him for a haskama, what would he say? And would he say what he just said, what we just read now? That the Chidushay, Baal Chidushay Harim was Yotzei Deichel Kriyat Shema b'di'avad, because he didn't know how to pronounce the Dalet. He won't say such a thing. Rav Kaminetzky was obviously of a different ilk, of a different type, a different caliber altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example of so when it comes down to a person saying, well, I have to follow Gedolei Torah, okay, I agree with you, you do. The question is, which Gadol Torah? This Gadol Torah or that Gadol Torah? That's already up to you, because there are many Gadolim. And it's not to be decided by the editorial board of Yothet Ne'eman who the Gadol Torah is and who he is not. That's not for them to decide. They may wish to decide and influence you and tell you this is how it is, but that's not their decision. And this is true for many things, not just for pronunciation. It's true also about how to look at many issues in our lives, in our reality today. As you said before, you mentioned about this certain rabbi coming from America, coming to Israel and telling people here what to do, as if he has the first clue about what goes on here and what doesn't and how things should work. Well, again, no one told you have to listen to him, because there are other people you could listen to, and that's already up to you. So Jews have to know that they have a choice, just like Hashem gave us the choice to choose between good and evil. We have Behira Hofshit, we have free choice. We also have free choice which Chacham to choose. The Mishnah in Avot, and well, this will end. The Mishnah in Avot says, Aselach Rav, choose for yourself a Rav, from whom you will study Torah. And another halacha, another Mishnah in Masechet Avot, it says at the end of the first perek, it says, Aselach Rav u'istalek min asafek. But it doesn't tell you who chooses the Rav for you. You choose the Rav. Aselach Rav. It doesn't say Yated Ne'eman Yaselach Rav. It doesn't tell you the school you went to will decide for you who your Rav is. You decide who your Rav is. And
Do we hold like this Mishnah? Do we hold like this?
Is it possible not to hold like a Mishnah? I'm not familiar with such a concept in the realm of Torah Judaism. Perhaps where that will end. But you see that it is possible to break free of these intellectual and spiritual handcuffs that are limiting our people's thought and people's practice and their experience of life as a Torah Jew. It is possible to choose a different path. Perhaps we'll end with that for today.
Yes. Thank you, Rav. Thank you.
May Hashem help Klal Yisrael to internalize your words, and may your words be accepted across the Jewish people for light and for hope for our people.
Well, very kind of you to suggest that. And Hashem, Ya'aseh hatov b'eino, and we must also do that which is correct and proper in our eyes, based on the best intentions and the best perceptions that we are capable of achieving.
Amen.
Shalom.
Thank you, Rav. Shalom.